Well, let's continue our conversation about leadership with our panel of party commentators. Susan Smith is a Liberal commentator, Tim Powers is a Conservative commentator, and Robin MacLachlan is an NDP commentator. We're going to get in a moment. I mean, there's new developments to talk about again today on the SNC Lavalin story and Jody Wilson-Raybould, as there seem to be for the last 6 weeks. We'll get to that in a moment. But let's pick up where I just heard from our two guests about concerns around polarization in the upcoming election campaign. We've seen it in other countries. We've seen it in the United States. My guests are suggesting it's coming to Canada, and when it's already here, and it's probably going to get worse in many ways unless we sort of have a conversation as a society about what we want to do differently in election campaigns and around the political discourse. Susan, let me start with you. What are your thoughts on where we're at and what we might be able to do to improve our democracy around this part of it, at least around discussion and disagreement and polarization?
Yeah, I think we're at a real pivot point, and we can go one way or the other on it, and I think our leaders will play a significant role, but I think individuals and people who are participating in the political discourse have to play a role. I think we've been subject to what's been going on in the US and the negative press and the negative rhetoric and the tribalism that's happening down there, and we have to be careful that we don't feed into it in Canada. And I think we're seeing examples, you know, Max Bernier and his People's Party is really trying to polarize people on the white, I don't know if it's white nationalist, but on the nationalist/populist side. And there are Ezra Levant's organization and the media and some of that stuff. The alt-right media, I think, is really trying to fan those flames. So I think it's up to leaders, it's up to politicians, and it's up to the people around the politicians like us who sit in these chairs to try and talk about what people have in common as opposed to exploiting the differences. What's happened, I think, around the world is people's fear. People are afraid of what's different. They're afraid of what they don't know.
Yeah, that's been pointed out by our experts. They see their world changing and they think they have no control over it. And the other thing is, Tim, social media. Social media allows an anonymity that it's almost built to drive a coarseness in the conversation because it can, and I think there are ways to avoid that.
Well, the only thing I really liked from Michael Wernick's presentation a number of weeks ago at the Justice Committee is how he described social media as a vomitorium, and more often than not, it is that where a lot of negativity gets trafficked as opposed to positive. But there's another reality to all of this, Peter, and we all know it. We live in this world, not just in the political world, but in the business world. Politics has become a lot more about out-and-out marketing and political marketing. And for good or for bad, sometimes differentiation, as the word that's often used to describe it, is easier to do when you have clear, directed positions that are easy to articulate and may appeal to one group or another. And because so much of politics has been infused by marketing, it's harder also for leaders to move back. You're caught between what Susan's talking about in terms of creating the right environment for a practical, sensible dialogue around what needs to be done, and then selling yourself and selling your party, because you can't make those changes until you win.
As one of our experts just pointed out, there's, to paraphrase Robin, there's no currency in nuance. I mean, there's really no point saying, you know, we have good ideas, but Robin's got good ideas, Tim has good ideas. Well, that may work against you getting elected when what you have to say is they have no good ideas, and the ideas they have are bad.
Well, it cheapens politics, but it also makes politics a lot easier. If you can eliminate choice, for the electorate, you cement the decision that somebody has in the frame that you want. So it's very tempting. It's tempting to make politics easier to fight, and by using fear-mongering or in trying to present this as an us against them, this whole others idea, that instead of there being a citizenry of an electorate that all gets to come together and choose our leadership, really there are some of us that are more enfranchised than others, and therefore we should ensure that we don't enfranchise those among us who we shouldn't trust. And of course I'm alluding to immigrants, new Canadians, people that may not share what somebody tries to define as a sense of values. And the danger there is, I think there are core Canadian values. So the term values has something that should be rich and should be pure to us, but instead it's being used as a way to define somebody as who they're not. And that's
but does anybody,
dangerous.
do you think we're going to see any changes?
No,
though? I mean, we're still 7 months out from the campaign, but the reason we're kind of doing this series this week at CPAC is because the kinds of things we're talking about, it's too late 2 weeks or a month before a campaign to have these conversations. You need to have them now. Is there any reason to have hope that there's a different way of doing things and maybe we find it?
Well, I hope that we do. I'll strike an optimistic note here. I think Canadians are sensitive to the nonsense that's gone on in the U.S. on social media and the whole fake news thing. Thank you, Donald Trump, for that. I think many
but a lot of
Canadians
us then pretend that that's not us and never will be. But
no, but I think we're going to be sensitive.
Take a look at Alberta right now.
The truth is we're headed that way.
Yes, I'm not saying we're not headed that way, but I think we are sensitive as consumers of that, hopefully. Not everybody will be, but I think more of us are sensitive to that and being able to dismiss whether something's true or not. I also think the government has put in place this nonpartisan commission to look at social media and things in interference in terms of the election.
Threats.
I think that's important too. We're being sensitive to that as well. I do think it's going to be an ugly election, but I'm hoping people will use their judgment and say that's not right or delete that or have more fulsome conversations as opposed to more divisive conversations.
Well, that's also the advice our experts are giving us is, look around, double check stuff, read stuff, get other points of view.
Get other rebuttal,
and challenge why you come to your own decisions. What's the thought process that gets you to a point that's more than just because my party says that's the right position?
Yeah, I think there is, in a way, less direct partisanship. I think there's more direct marketing as we're talking to, and it's not just somebody who may identify as a liberal or a conservative or a New Democrat. You're finding voter cohorts where if it's an issue of economic anxiety or it's an issue of religious empowerment, what have you, leaders market to them. I think the challenge, Peter, of breaking out of it is this behavior has been ingrained for 20 or so years, if not longer, in terms of hardcore political marketing. And to get leaders of all parties to step back from it now is very difficult to do. I mean, credit this Prime Minister. This isn't a partisan shot, but he's built a brand. Part of his brand is about going against the so-called divisive rhetoric, but you could argue that isn't actually what he's done. He's built a brand, Scheer's building a brand, Mr. Singh's building a brand. They're not about to abandon their brand build because they hope their brand build propels them to victory.
Right, well, I mean, looking at this election, I think we are quite vulnerable to this being the most divisive, and I think the most vulnerable to being that type of Americanized Trump-style politics. I mean, we have the first ever racialized leader of a Canadian political party. We have a new upstart party that seems to, within its raison d'etre, be to try to scare Canadians against newcomers. That's being the People's Party and Maxime Bernier. And, probably this will make my opponents angry because I like to bring up this issue.
Well, we're not opponents today, remember, we're together.
Of course. Well, then, in the spirit of that, Justin Trudeau and the Liberals talked about his once heralded electoral reform campaign would bring about, if we went to proportional representation, upstart parties like Maxime Bernier's and the People's Party. But what it would have done is avoid something that even the NDP does when it can, which is to try to narrow the choice. So in the last election, for a while there, the NDP was saying the Liberals aren't even in contention, even though they ended up winning. And the choice is between Harper and Mulcair, because that makes it easier to win. But with electoral reform, it's less about, at the national level at least, saying you only have two choices, you only have two doors. It's about electing a parliament and then forming a government. And I think that we missed an opportunity there to fix our electoral system in a way that would help Canadians feel they did have a true choice at the local level.
Okay, some leadership. Let's pivot to from that conversation, and I suppose we have to get a little bit partisan here because I want to get your.
Oh, is that my fault now?
No.
Always the New Democrat.
But thoughtful and partisan doesn't mean that we don't like each other at the end of the conversation or that we don't have good points to make.
We all have beer together.
Right. So I've never been invited to that. Okay, so
you can come next time.
So more developments today in the SNC-Lavalin affair, and it takes me to this. So Jody Wilson-Raybould says she agrees with Lisa Raitt of the Conservatives. There should be an investigation into leaks around what conflict may or may not have existed between her and the Prime Minister over Supreme Court appointments. She says that should be looked into. But the question I want to ask is, given how long this has gone on, and this is a question for all of them, how has this undermined the Prime Minister's leadership? How has this presented a problem for Justin Trudeau? And then I want to ask questions as well about what are the risks of undermining leadership for Jagmeet Singh and Andrew Scheer, and then we'll be done. Susan?
I imagine the caption on this: Susan sighs deeply and rolls her eyes.
And drinks that beer.
Yeah, it's a shot of whiskey. I think it's having an impact at the moment. I'm not sure it's going to have a long-term fatal impact on the Prime Minister. Sure, there are dips in the polls because this thing is taking so long, it's going on so long, and there is the drip, drip, drip of the story from the Jody Wilson-Raybould, which to me seems very calculated to be able to drag this out as long as possible. But it's the end of March and the election's in October. So I think the Prime Minister and the Liberal government has an opportunity to remind Canadians of their record and show Canadians their vision and contrast it with the other leaders who don't yet have a platform or a vision that they've put forward. And in the absence of that, the Liberals can continue to show what they've been doing right for Canadians.
All right, so the polls have shown that this is hurting the Liberal brand, but so far there's no personal pickup that we see for Andrew Scheer or Jagmeet Singh. So Tim, the question for you is, everybody can say good things about party leaders, but what I want to ask you is to talk to me about the vulnerabilities. We're a long way from the vote, but what should Andrew Scheer be concerned about that could undermine his leadership?
I think he's got a few things to be concerned about. One is the frame that is trying to be hung over him around where he stands on intolerance and what is his true view around all that. That's always a vulnerability for a Conservative leader unless he or she's entirely clear on that. I think he's taken some steps, did last week at the Manning Centre, to try and address that. I think he's got some vulnerability when it comes to certain cohorts on an environmental plan. What is he going to say? He's got to say something other than the carbon tax, it sucks and it's dreadful. And I think his third vulnerability is making sure that he has a good fiscal plan, because that is the card he's playing right now.
And showing up in all the polling, affordability is probably still the number one issue.
And that's the one,
I
would just say that's the one thing where the Conservatives need to get more aggressive in the conversation, is where do they stand on affordability? Because I think we would all agree, the polling abacus and others have said that's the issue. Conservatives only started to use the word again after using it originally. All
right, last word to you, Robin, on Jagmeet Singh and his vulnerabilities.
Sure. So the vulnerability Jagmeet Singh has right now is that not enough people know who Jagmeet Singh is. But that is, in this age of brand type style politics, an opportunity for him, especially as Justin Trudeau's brand as this kind of courageous, feminist, new styled leader who was going to change politics in Ottawa. As that erodes, he has an opportunity to pick up a little bit on the hopeful, optimistic campaign that Justin Trudeau campaigned on in 2015, which I've said before. Justin Trudeau is picking up almost on the coattails of Jack Layton from 2011. So Jagmeet Singh needs to reclaim that mantle for the NDP, and he can do that in part by talking about the issues Tim was talking about and that Abacus talked about, affordability. It was quite fitting that he got to campaign for a seat in Burnaby because he was able to talk about cost of living, housing, and it's an area where, while the Liberals can talk about GDP growth over their reign, they have a little bit harder time talking about kitchen table style cost of living issues. So he needs to build up a brand as the guy that's on the side of the average Canadian, but he doesn't have a lot of time.
Right.
Okay. I disagree with Robin a little bit on that one. I agree that Mr. Singh has to get known. The problem is he's got to get known. He has 6 months. He's got to figure out how Parliament works, and he's got to get his caucus behind him, and he's got to put together a platform and get that out the door, and he's doing that all at the same time.
Okay, I asked for his biggest vulnerability. You gave me 6 more. That's not fair. That's not what it's supposed to be about.
But on the affordability issue, I challenge my colleagues, Robin in particular, because I think Mr. Trudeau has a track record. He can talk about the Canada Child Benefit. He can talk about what's being done for seniors. He can talk about a national housing strategy. That's what he's doing.
Yeah.
But I think
and in the moment, I mean, he's got to, I got to wrap up, but he's got to get back to that in terms of leadership, because right now the oxygen is being sucked up by SNC.
Yeah, he needs to stop talking about SNC and talk about those things.
We have to stop talking now. But listen, thank you. Good conversation. We'll talk again.
Thanks, Peter.
Bye now.